January 6th, and this is the day that a pro forma certification of a vote for president is typically handled in Washington, but there's nothing pro forma, there's nothing routine anymore. Under tight security, the vote was taken, and of course, the certification was complete. It was not a dramatic thing at all, and there was no melodrama. And of course, the additional layer of potential drama was the fact that Vice President Kamala Harris presided over the certification, right? Just as Mike Pence was to have presided over the certification in the 2020 election. But even as the certification goes on, and you know how we feel about it, I mean, this guy is, Trump's an adjudicated insurrectionist. He is, by any reading of the Constitution, not permitted legally to take the office of the president. But laws are no good, and a constitution is no good without an enforcement mechanism that has the muscle to make it happen. And so Trump and his administration of oligarchs will take office in just a couple of weeks. And the constitutional disconnect is something that's not even really being remarked upon in many circles, certainly in no mainstream circles, and certainly in no right-wing circles. Those who were involved in that insurrection took on different roles, right? They took on the roles of the legal, trying to somehow legally undermine, by going to court, various certification totals of votes in states. You had to go state by state to do that. The following, that is to say, after that was unsuccessful, the following efforts were far more despicable, might be the word I'd use. The upending of the Justice Department, the installation of, or proposed installation of, a new Justice Department head, Attorney General, who would declare that there were questions about the election, even though there were none. Trump giving the directive, I don't need there to actually be any evidence. I simply need you to announce, to release a statement that there were problems. And in so doing, you create an atmosphere of chaos around the election, and that would allow Trump any number of options that were on the table, one of which was declaring martial law. And then, of course, the January 6th rally, protest, and violent insurrection, takeover of the Capitol building. So as police officers and other security personnel were pounded and sprayed and attacked, there was a real question as to whether or not this nation, teetering as it was in that moment, would continue in any way with some kind of procession toward a transfer of power. And the president at that time was Donald Trump, and he watched it all, I'd suggest, with a gleeful sense of what was happening. Those were all his followers. They were doing his bidding. And he was reluctant. In fact, he was essentially watching this all as a sporting event. He had no intent to stop it, even as people were begging him, calling him, telling him this is bad for your legacy. I mean, even the Fox News people were calling him. All of these things were laid bare in the January 6th committee hearings, and we saw it played out, and that's why we say he's an adjudicated insurrectionist in Colorado. When Colorado, pointing to this and laying out these bits of evidence that I've described in kind of broad strokes, they laid that out for a court. And then that court judgment, which did again find him guilty of insurrection, that was appealed to the Colorado Supreme Court, and they upheld it. And then it was kicked up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court didn't say that the lower court was wrong. They simply said this isn't a situation in which the state should have the power to remove this guy from the ballot, because that's what it was all about in Colorado, removing Trump's name because of his role as the lead insurrectionist. So what happened? I'll get to the rewriting of the history and the whitewashing of the events of J6, but what happened to many of those people who took the violent course, the last course, the attack on the Capitol? Some of those cases continue to churn on. Tony, here's a sense of this January 6th and a look back a little bit at what's happened to those who were involved in the January 6th insurrection. And
Congress is set to certify Donald Trump's victory in the presidential election today, January 6th. 4 years ago, then President Trump urged supporters to head to the Capitol to protest congressional certification of Joe Biden's victory. Nearly 1,600 people have faced charges related to the riot. Overnight, the U.S. Attorney's Office revealed it's evaluating whether to bring charges in roughly 200 new cases. Trump has promised to pardon some of the January 6th defendants. Senate Majority Leader John Thune is comparing Trump's potential pardons to recent pardons made by President Biden.
As we've discovered under the Biden administration, the pardon authority is a very broad one. I mean, he's taken it to a whole new level.
As the majority leader in the Senate, though, what message do you think it would send to give pardons to people who pleaded guilty to attacking police officers who stormed this building 4 years ago?
Well, look, I mean, again, it's ultimately going to be a decision that the President of the United States, the pardon authority exists with him.
As one of her last official acts as vice president, Kamala Harris today will certify her own loss. President Biden is asking Americans not to forget the events of January 6, 2021, writing in the Washington Post, quote, "We cannot accept a repeat of what occurred 4 years ago." And speaking about Trump, Biden said, quote, "I think what he did was a genuine threat to democracy, and I'm hopeful that we're beyond it." Security is much tighter around the Capitol than 4 years ago, with extensive fencing and new training in place. Law enforcement in Washington also preparing for the state funeral of former President Jimmy Carter. Carter's body will remain in Atlanta through today before making the trip to D.C. for Thursday's funeral, where President Biden will deliver the eulogy. Thousands of extra police officers are brought in with hundreds of soldiers on standby, and the D.C. National Guard activated to protect both Carter's funeral and today's election certification. And now the snowstorm hitting Washington is not expected to affect today's events. Even if the government is closed, we expect the election certification to go forward.
Well, as we told you, it has gone forward and the certification went down. You know, I think it's not a small matter on some level, just from a standpoint of messaging, that Joe Biden wrote that op-ed. I like that he wrote it. It was nothing we didn't know. A lot of what he said, I said even at the open of this show. He kind of recapitulated events of the day. He talked about the transfer of power. And I'm trying to find you a quote that might, reflect sort of the best of that piece. I found it to be, typical Biden. And again, I'm not saying that Biden is always with it and always sharp. And obviously we've seen his mental acuity diminish. But I think his general policies and general statements that come out of the White House, I don't really have a problem with. And he said after all what we all witnessed on January 6, 2021, we know we can never again take this for granted. He doesn't mention Trump directly, but he says an unrelenting effort has been underway to rewrite, even erase, the history of that day, to tell us we didn't see what we all saw with our own eyes. We cannot allow the truth to be lost. And of course, he vowed that the certification this year would be handled peacefully, and it was indeed. He says, but on this day, we cannot forget, we should commit to our remembering January 6, 2021, every year, to remember it as a day when our democracy was put to the test and prevailed, to remember that democracy, even in America, is never guaranteed. The Trump response is something quite different. Trump views many of those who were part of January 6th as freedom fighters. I mean, when I say he views them that way, he knows the truth. But he has now twisted and perverted the day's events and the history that we all know to create this bizarre patriotism around an attempted violent takeover. I mean, it was violent, but the attempt was the takeover. They talk about a transition. They're always saying, oh, no, we want to have a smooth transition from party to party of government. That was Trump talking to radio host. Well, they're making it really difficult. They're throwing everything they can in the way. This is Donald Trump 101. You know, he takes a serious threat to democracy and he twists it into some patriotic act. And the other thing that he's done, and this is really quite concerning, is he's turned this horrifying narrative that played out on January 6th, 2021, into this, and it's an evolution. That's why I mentioned this. You can watch it happen into this aura of patriotism matched with a kind of love that one should have for those who were involved. And this is a guy who was, you know, pulled back from the brink. You've heard me say it before. I mean, Donald Trump was done, man. Done after January 6th. Even his closest allies, Lindsey Graham. McConnell, I wouldn't call him an ally, but he was blocking for Trump, I mean, legislatively. Both of them and all of them. McCarthy, Kevin McCarthy in the House. These are all people who stood up and said, I've had enough. I mean, Lindsey Graham literally said, I've had enough. I'm not doing this anymore. And then Trump, who seemed mortally wounded politically, reconstituted himself, continued to have tremendous political power, and the gravitational force associated with MAGA Nation brought all of those people to whom I've just referred, brought them back into the fold. And they all went in some manner, literally went to Mar-a-Lago and then sucked up to him, apologized to him, connected with him in some way, pledged a fealty to him that we've seen continue. So Trump again rose to power, and this is the greatest reconstitution of political power in the history of this country. To be as completely decimated as Trump was, lost the election, lost appeals, clearly involved in the insurrection, adjudicated as such, and somehow gets back on the stump, back on television. He's a captivating figure, charismatic figure, a total con artist, a total BS machine. And he got out there with conservative media led by Fox News Channel carrying his water, and he played J6 as patriotic acts that were carried out by the most patriotic Americans. He has the national anthem sung by those who were imprisoned, convicted and imprisoned for their roles in the January 6th insurrection. And now he has the platform as president to further change this Capitol riot into a day of patriotic devotion to him and to the Constitution or whatever other things he wants to throw in. Because it's going to be a day in which they start to salute the J6 rioters. This has happened, you know, I hate to say this because this is a completely, I suspect, overused, and whenever it's mentioned, it's sort of this radioactive comparison when you mention Hitler. But I'm going to mention Hitler only because it was his same dance that he did when he took on the Weimar Republic, and there was a huge, not so dissimilar in the sense that there was a huge confrontation in which I think somewhere around 7 police officers, German police officers, were killed, and 14 of Hitler's supporters were killed, and they end up imprisoning Hitler for a year. That's when he wrote Mein Kampf. And he emerged from that, this troubled, you'd think, stained, and impossible political figure to imagine that he could rise from that into a place of power. And I don't need to tell you what happened with the Third Reich. So the important thing as related to that narrative, which is why I wanted to mention it, is that Hitler turned that confrontation with the Weimar Republic. He turned that officially into a day of remembrance for those who stood up for him against the government of Germany. And that's what Trump is doing with his J6 supporters. He's talked about and will likely pardon many of them. And he is going to change the way that officially, at least in Washington, January 6th is viewed. We know the truth, but now in a position of power, he can reframe the Capitol riot in a completely different way. There was a good piece on this, the Mark Thompson show. I just wish that Congress would invoke the 14th Amendment, Section 3, on the floor to put it on the books, even if they would lose that for the sake of integrity, says Chris Moore. Thank you for the $10 super chat. You're right, Chris, and we talked about this in the last couple of weeks. As I started the show by saying, it is insanity to me that someone who is a fully adjudicated insurrectionist can ascend to the presidency. I mean, it is illegal, but you've got to have some institution enforcing that law, and you must have Congress to do it. And Congress is cowed completely by the political heft that Donald Trump has. And so without Congress, you saw it happen. Mitch McConnell kicked the can down the road. When the House adjudicated the events of January 6th, they turned them over to the Senate. The way impeachment works in this country, of course, is impeaching is sort of like indicting. It's a charge. It's brought to the House. It passed the House with bipartisan support, moves to the Senate, and the Senate kicked the can down. The Senate, that became the center of gravity for Donald Trump to slip away from being held to account. And so you saw McConnell say, well, this is something we should handle on the outside. Then you saw Merrick Garland kick the can even further. He was a Democrat. Leave aside party affiliation. I mean, it's a question of legality. You're the lead justice officer in the land, and you don't see anything here to follow up on? It's outrageous. And I've talked to you about the way I view Merrick Garland. I view him, I think all of this sits at his feet. I mean, you can go back before that. You can go to Biden for the appointment of Merrick Garland, et cetera. You can go, there is blame to go around, but I put Merrick Garland, if not at the head of the parade, pretty close to the head of the parade, because you legitimately, without any kind of patina of political vengeance, could bring charges to Trump right away. The J6 committee laid it all bare, and that's the only reason that Garland stepped up. I thought it's inexcusable, absolutely inexcusable. So even as these 1,600 defendants pleaded guilty and 200 or more have been convicted after the trial, I stand aghast at the fact that the riot on January 6th will be reconstituted as a patriotic act. I mean, despite all the condemnation, despite all of the obvious realizations of what happened. There are complete fabrications as to who was behind the riot. I mean, I was at a dinner with somebody who's a MAGA adjacent type guy, and he said, well, I think Antifa was really there whipping up the crowd. There were a lot of leftists in that crowd. Really? So that's a fabrication. I mean, that there were FBI agents probably embedded in that crowd, I have no doubt. I mean, I think that was a security measure, but that they were behind whipping up the crowd and trying to produce this violence, to what end? How does that even make sense? How does that narrative even hold any water? Like, what was the plan then? Yeah. So they wanted to, you're telling me the incoming administration wanted to whip up a riot to overturn their victory? Or I don't quite get it. But the minute you mention a deep state conspiracy and you mention any number of narratives that are completely invented, you begin to open the door to letting those who were involved in January 6th off the hook for what they did, and then an even more loathsome transition into the fact that those involved with January 6th at the Capitol are elevated to some perch associated with a patriotic act. It's so grotesque that it just astounds me on another level. But that is the successful dance that has been done by right-wing media and this former president and now president-elect Donald Trump.
Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell, you'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.